In the heart of New Haven, a city known for its old brick buildings and bustling streets, stood the Grand Courthouse. It was an imposing structure with tall columns and heavy wooden doors that creaked when they opened. Inside, Judge Caldwell sat behind his polished oak desk, gavel in hand, ready to deliver justice, or at least what he thought was justice. Judge Caldwell wasn't just any judge. He had been on the bench for over 20 years, and during that time he had earned a reputation for being strict, sharp-tongued, and deeply opinionated. Some people admired him for his no-nonsense approach, while others whispered about how unfair he could be. What everyone agreed on, though, was this: Caldwell didn't like surprises. He preferred things neat, predictable, and orderly. On this particular morning, the courtroom was filled with the usual mix of defendants, lawyers, and spectators. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee. A few reporters sat near the back, scribbling notes into small notebooks. Among them, nobody paid much attention to a young man sitting quietly at the defendant's table. His name was Marcus, and today, he was here to fight a minor traffic ticket. Marcus looked out of place in the formal setting. He wore a simple pair of jeans, a plain white shirt, and sneakers that were scuffed from wear. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the pale walls of the courtroom. To most people, including Judge Caldwell, he looked like someone who didn't belong there, someone who probably didn't know the first thing about the law. When it was Marcus's turn to present his case, Caldwell glanced down at the file before him. "Next up," he announced in a booming voice, "Marcus Johnson versus the state of Connecticut. Alleged illegal U-turn." He paused, looking over his glasses at Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, do you have legal representation?" Marcus shook his head. "No, Your Honor, I'll represent myself." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You're representing yourself? Well, isn't that interesting?" There was a hint of mockery in his tone, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus closely. "Do you even know the rules of this court, son?" he asked, letting the word son hang in the air like a challenge. Marcus met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "I've done my research, Your Honor. I believe I'm prepared." Caldwell chuckled softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Prepared? We'll see about that." Then turning to the prosecutor, he said, "Let's get started. Show me what we've got." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Mr. Grayson, stepped forward. He began outlining the charges against Marcus, explaining that a police officer had witnessed him making an illegal U-turn late one night. According to Grayson, the violation was clear-cut and Marcus should pay the fine. As Grayson spoke, Marcus listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes on a pad of paper. His calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Caldwell further. The judge tapped his fingers impatiently on the desk, his expression growing increasingly annoyed. Finally, it was Marcus's turn to speak. Standing up slowly, he addressed the court. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to present some evidence." Caldwell rolled his eyes. "Evidence? From you? Go ahead then. Let's see what kind of evidence a layman can produce." Ignoring the sarcasm, Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out several photographs. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. "These photos show the road where the alleged U-turn took place," Marcus explained. "As you can see, the lane markings are faded and unclear. Even the stop sign is barely visible. This creates confusion for drivers, especially at night." For a moment, there was silence in the courtroom. Caldwell flipped through the photos, his brow furrowing slightly. They were indeed damning, proof that the city hadn't maintained the road properly. But instead of acknowledging this, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Technicalities," he muttered. "That doesn't excuse breaking the law." Marcus remained unfazed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law requires proper signage and clear road markings. Without them, how can drivers be expected to follow the rules?" Now it was Caldwell's turn to bristle. He slammed his gavel on the desk, causing a sharp crack to echo through the room. "Enough!" he barked. "You think you can come in here with your little pictures and lecture us about the law? Who do you think you are?" The question hung, in the air, heavy with judgment. Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second before replying. "I'm just a citizen trying to defend myself, Your Honor. Nothing more, nothing less." His answer seemed to infuriate Caldwell even more. Leaning forward, the judge fixed Marcus with a piercing glare. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Johnson. People like you don't belong in a courtroom unless they're sitting in the defendant's chair. You don't understand the law, and you certainly don't respect it." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed Caldwell's prejudice. Marcus clenched his jaw briefly, then relaxed. He knew better than to let anger cloud his judgment. Instead, he resolved to prove the judge wrong, not through confrontation, but through logic and facts. "Thank you for your feedback, Your Honor," Marcus said calmly. "If I may continue." Reluctantly, Caldwell gestured for him to proceed. What followed was a masterclass in legal reasoning. Marcus cited specific sections of the municipal code, pointing out discrepancies in the prosecution's argument. He highlighted cases where similar violations had been dismissed due to poor road conditions. Each point he made was precise, well-researched, and impossible to ignore. Yet despite Marcus's brilliance, Caldwell refused to give him credit. The judge interrupted frequently, scoffing at Marcus's arguments and making snide remarks. "Oh, so now you're an expert on municipal codes?" he sneered at one point. "What's next? Are you going to start quoting Supreme Court decisions, too?" Everyone's surprised, Marcus smiled. "Actually, yes, in Smith v. City of Hartford, the court ruled that—" "Enough!" Caldwell shouted, cutting him off. But the damage was done. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs, and even Mr. Grayson looked uneasy. For the first time, Caldwell felt uncertain, and it showed. By the end of Marcus's presentation, the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now admiration. Spectators exchanged glances, whispering about the young man who had turned the tables on both the prosecutor and the judge. Even Caldwell, for all his bluster, couldn't deny that Marcus had outsmarted them. As the session adjourned, Marcus gathered his papers and left the courtroom quietly. Outside, reporters waited eagerly, drawn by rumors of the dramatic showdown. Inside. But Marcus ignored them, walking away with quiet confidence. He knew this was only the beginning. Back in the courtroom, Caldwell sat alone in his chambers, staring at the stack of photos Marcus had submitted. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Had he misjudged the young man? And if so, what did that say about him? Little did Caldwell know this encounter would change everything, for both of them. This version of Part 1 sets the stage for the conflict between Marcus and Judge Caldwell, introducing their personalities and motivations while building tension through dialogue and action. The language is straightforward yet engaging, designed to draw readers into the story. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Judge Caldwell called the session back to order. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his posture relaxed but focused, like a chess player preparing for their next move. Across the room, Mr. Grayson, the prosecutor, flipped through his notes, trying to regain control of the narrative after Marcus's unexpected display of legal knowledge. Caldwell banged his gavel sharply, silencing the whispers. "Order in the court," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He turned his attention to Grayson. "Mr. Prosecutor, do you have anything further to add?" Grayson cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor. While the defense has raised interesting points about road conditions, we must remember that the law is clear. An illegal U-turn is an illegal U-turn, regardless of external factors." His tone was firm, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He had underestimated Marcus, and now he was scrambling to recover. "Proceed," Caldwell said curtly, folding his arms across his chest. Grayson nodded and continued. "Moreover, Your Honor, we have eyewitness testimony confirming that the defendant made the U-turn under full visibility. This isn't just a case of poor signage. It's blatant disregard for traffic laws." At this, Marcus raised his hand slightly. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Caldwell sighed heavily, rolling his eyes. "Fine, Mr. Johnson, speak." Marcus stood up again, his movements deliberate and composed. "Thank you, Your Honor. While I appreciate the prosecution's efforts, I'd like to clarify something. Poor road conditions aren't merely external factors. They directly affect how drivers interpret the law. If a driver can't see the signs or markings, how can they reasonably be expected to follow them? Before Caldwell could interject, Marcus pressed on. Furthermore, if the city fails to maintain its infrastructure, it shares responsibility for any resulting confusion. My actions were not reckless, they were a response to unclear instructions from the environment. The courtroom fell silent. Even Caldwell seemed momentarily taken aback by the logic of Marcus's argument, but instead of acknowledging it, he leaned forward, his expression hardening. Are you suggesting that the government is at fault here? That's quite a bold claim, Mr. Johnson. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm suggesting that accountability works both ways, Your Honor. Laws exist to guide behavior, but those laws lose meaning if the tools to enforce them are broken. In this case, the road itself failed to communicate the rules clearly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, from the corner of the room, a low murmur spread among the spectators. Some nodded approvingly, while others exchanged surprised glances. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that Marcus's words resonated far beyond this single case. They touched on broader issues of fairness and responsibility, issues the judge preferred to avoid. But Grayson wasn't ready to concede defeat. Clearing his throat once more, he announced, Your Honor, in light of the defendant's arguments, I'd like to call a witness to testify. A ripple of curiosity ran through the crowd. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. A witness? At this stage? Yes, Your Honor, Grayson replied confidently. Officer Daniels, who issued the citation, is present today. He can confirm what he observed that night. Caldwell hesitated, then waved his hand dismissively. Very well. Bring him in. As Officer Daniels took the stand, Marcus felt a flicker of concern. Witnesses could be unpredictable, especially in cases like this. Still, he reminded himself to stay calm. Whatever happened, he would handle it methodically. Daniels was a stocky man with close-cropped hair and a stern expression. After being sworn in, he recounted the events of the night in question. I was patrolling the area around midnight when I saw the defendant make an illegal U-turn near the intersection. There were no other cars around, so it was easy to spot. Marcus listened carefully, taking mental notes. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he approached the witness stand with measured steps. Officer Daniels, Marcus began, his voice steady. You mentioned seeing my vehicle make a U-turn. Can you describe the lighting conditions at the time? Daniels frowned slightly. It was dark, but the streetlights provided adequate illumination. And what about the road markings? Marcus asked. Could you see them clearly? The officer hesitated. Well, some parts were faded, but overall they were visible enough. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying the markings were partially faded? Yes, Daniels admitted reluctantly. Thank you, Marcus said, turning back toward the judge. Your Honor, this confirms my earlier point. Even the officer admits the road markings were problematic. Now let me ask Officer Daniels another question. How many times have you issued citations for similar violations in this area? Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm not sure of the exact number. But you've issued multiple citations, correct? Marcus pressed. Yes. Daniels replied cautiously. Marcus smiled faintly. And yet, despite these repeated violations, nothing has been done to improve the road conditions. Doesn't that suggest negligence on the part of the city? Before Daniels could answer, Caldwell interrupted impatiently. Enough of this. Line of questioning, Mr. Johnson. Stick to the facts of the case. Marcus inclined his head respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. Just one final question for the officer. Have you ever been disciplined for falsifying reports? The courtroom erupted into gasps. Daniels stiffened, his face reddening. What? No, that's completely false. Marcus held up a document. According to public records, Officer Daniels was reprimanded 3 years ago for submitting inaccurate information in a separate incident. Isn't that true, officer? Daniels sputtered, unable to form a coherent response. Caldwell slammed his gavel repeatedly, shouting, Order! Order in the court! When the commotion finally died down, Marcus addressed the judge. Your Honor, I submit that Officer Daniels' credibility is questionable given his history. His testimony should therefore carry less weight in determining the validity of this citation. Caldwell stared at Marcus, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he realized he might have underestimated the young man standing before him. Marcus's arguments weren't just clever, they were devastatingly effective. Grayson, sensing the tide turning against him, tried to salvage the situation. Your Honor, even if the officer's past is questionable, the fact remains that the defendant committed an illegal U-turn. We cannot ignore the law simply because the defendant has raised technicalities. Marcus shook his head. With all due respect, these aren't mere technicalities. They're fundamental principles of justice. If the system itself is flawed, then enforcing its rules becomes meaningless. The courtroom erupted again, this time with applause from the spectators. Caldwell banged his gavel furiously, his face flushed with anger. That's enough. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As the bailiff escorted everyone out, Marcus packed up his papers calmly, ignoring the reporters clamoring for his attention outside. Inside the judge's chambers, however, Caldwell sat alone, staring at the empty courtroom. His confidence had been shaken, and for the first time in years he questioned whether he truly understood the role of a judge, or the people who appeared before him. Little did Caldwell know, Marcus had only begun to reveal his true identity and his real intentions. This version of Part 2 builds on the tension established in Part 1, showcasing Marcus's growing dominance in the courtroom while exposing weaknesses in the prosecution's case. The language remains accessible yet engaging, using dialogue and action to drive the story forward. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the dramatic events of the previous day, how a young man named Marcus Johnson had dismantled the prosecution's case with his sharp intellect and unshakable composure. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Spectators whispered excitedly among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. Even Judge Caldwell seemed unusually tense as he entered the room, his robes billowing behind him. "Order in the court," Caldwell barked, banging his gavel before anyone could say a word. The murmurs died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Everyone knew this wasn't just another routine hearing. It was something special. Caldwell glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly at the defendant's table, flipping through a stack of papers. For the first time, the judge allowed himself a fleeting moment of doubt. Who was this young man? How did he know so much about the law? These questions gnawed at Caldwell, but he pushed them aside and focused on the task at hand. "Mr. Grayson," Caldwell said, addressing the prosecutor, "do you have anything further to present?" Grayson stood up nervously, adjusting his tie. He had spent the night reviewing every detail of the case, searching for a way to regain control, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was always one step ahead. Still, he wasn't about to give up without a fight. "Yes, Your Honor," Grayson replied. "I'd like to revisit some key points regarding the alleged road conditions. While the defense has raised valid concerns, we must remember that drivers are ultimately responsible for their actions. Even if the markings were unclear, Mr. Johnson should have exercised caution." Marcus listened intently, nodding occasionally, as though considering Grayson's words. When it came time for his rebuttal, he rose smoothly to his feet, exuding confidence. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and calm, "the prosecution is correct in stating that drivers bear responsibility for their actions. However, that responsibility is shared with those who design and maintain our roads. If a driver cannot reasonably interpret the rules due to negligence on the part of the city, then holding them solely accountable is unjust." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Furthermore, I'd like to address a larger issue here, one that goes beyond this specific case. Our legal system is built on fairness and accountability. Yet too often, individuals are penalized for circumstances beyond their control while systemic failures go unchecked. This isn't just about me or this U-turn. It's about ensuring that justice applies equally to everyone." The courtroom erupted into murmurs again, and even Caldwell looked momentarily stunned. Marcus's argument wasn't just logical, it was deeply moral, appealing to principles that resonated with everyone present. But Caldwell refused to let himself be swayed. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said sharply, "this court is not a platform for philosophical debates. Stick to the facts of the case." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor. Let's return to the facts then." He turned to face Grayson. "Mr. Prosecutor, earlier you claimed that the markings were adequate. Can you explain exactly what constitutes adequate visibility under municipal guidelines?" Grayson hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Well, I suppose it depends on various factors." "Precisely," Marcus interrupted, seizing the opportunity. "It depends on factors such as lighting, weather conditions, and the condition of the road itself. And according to Department of Transportation standards, faded markings fail to meet these criteria. Therefore, the road where this incident occurred did not provide adequate guidance for drivers." Grayson opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Marcus's argument hanging heavy in the air. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that the tide was turning decisively against the prosecution. Desperate to regain some semblance of authority, Caldwell interjected. "Enough of this back and forth. Mr. Johnson, do you have any closing remarks before we proceed to deliberation?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing this was his moment. Slowly, he walked to the center of the courtroom, his movements deliberate and measured. All eyes were on him as he addressed the judge and, indirectly, the entire room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying a quiet intensity, "I appreciate the opportunity to defend myself today. But before you render your decision, I want to clarify something. I'm not just a random individual who happened to get pulled over for a traffic violation. My name is Marcus Johnson, and I'm a third-year law student at Harvard University. Over the past 2 years, I've clerked for several top-tier law firms, including one based right here in New Haven." The courtroom gasped audibly. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes while spectators exchanged astonished glances. Caldwell froze, his face pale with shock. He stared at Marcus, struggling to reconcile the humble defendant before him with the brilliant legal mind he now understood him to be. "I chose to represent myself in this case because I wanted to test my skills," Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "But more importantly, I wanted to highlight the biases that still exist within our justice system. Too often, people are judged not by their actions, but by their appearance, their background, or their perceived status. Today, I hope I've shown that intelligence and capability come in all forms, and that assumptions can lead to grave mistakes." When Marcus finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Even the bailiff struggled to restore order, as Caldwell sat frozen, his gavel hovering uselessly above the desk. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave. He had mocked and ridiculed someone who was not only highly qualified, but also far more knowledgeable than most lawyers he encountered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Caldwell managed to speak. "Court is adjourned," he muttered weakly, barely audible over the noise. Without waiting for objections or comments, he retreated hastily to his chambers, slamming the door behind him. Outside the courtroom, chaos ensued. Reporters surrounded Marcus, firing questions at him from all directions. "How does it feel to prove the judge wrong?" one asked. "What inspired you to take on this case pro se?" another chimed in. Marcus handled the attention gracefully, smiling politely but declining to comment until after the verdict. Back in his chambers, Caldwell slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. Everything he thought he knew about fairness, judgment, and professionalism felt like it was crumbling around him. He replayed Marcus's closing statement in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Was this really who he had become? A man so blinded by prejudice that he couldn't recognize brilliance when it stood right in front of him. For the first time in decades, Caldwell questioned whether he deserved to wear the robe. This version of Part 3 builds toward the climactic revelation of Marcus's true identity, showcasing his eloquence and strategic thinking while exposing Caldwell's biases. The narrative uses accessible language and vivid descriptions to keep readers engaged, emphasizing the emotional impact of the unfolding drama. The courtroom was eerily quiet when Judge Caldwell reemerged from his chambers. His face was pale, his usual air of authority replaced by an unmistakable tension. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, uncertain, not just about the case but about himself. The weight of Marcus's words lingered in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though the command carried less force than usual. Everyone stood, including Marcus, who looked as composed as ever. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos swirling inside Caldwell's mind. As the judge took his seat, he avoided making eye contact with anyone, especially Marcus. "Before we proceed," Caldwell began, his voice quieter than usual, "does either side wish to add anything further?" Grayson, the prosecutor, glanced nervously at Marcus before shaking his head. "No, Your Honor." Marcus nodded politely. "Nor do I, Your Honor. I believe the facts have been presented clearly." Caldwell swallowed hard, gripping the edge of his desk tightly. He knew what he had to do next, but it didn't make the task any easier. After a long pause, he cleared his throat and addressed the court. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony provided during this trial," Caldwell said, his tone measured but strained, "I find that the prosecution has failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, the charges against Mr. Johnson are hereby dismissed." The courtroom erupted into murmurs once again. Spectators exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly while others whispered excitedly about the outcome. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for their stories. But for Caldwell, the verdict felt hollow, a stark reminder of his own failure. As the bailiff called for order, Caldwell turned his attention to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he said, forcing a tight smile, "you've demonstrated an impressive understanding of the law today. I commend you for your preparation." It was clear that Caldwell was trying to save face, but his words rang false even to his own ears. Marcus met the judge's gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. Instead of responding immediately, he simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and quiet defiance. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus finally replied, his voice smooth and respectful. "However, I must point out that preparation alone isn't enough to ensure justice. Justice requires fairness, humility, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even when they challenge our assumptions." The room fell silent. Every word Marcus spoke seemed to strike a nerve, not just with Caldwell but with everyone present. Even Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming nervously on the surface of his desk. When Marcus finished speaking, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't anger or hostility. It was something deeper, more profound. The spectators weren't just watching a legal battle unfold, they were witnessing a reckoning, and no one felt it more acutely than Caldwell himself. Later that afternoon, Caldwell sat alone in his chambers, staring blankly at the stack of files piled high on his desk. His thoughts raced, replaying every moment of the trial, the smug remarks he'd made, the dismissive glances, the condescending tone. Each memory felt like a dagger twisting deeper into his conscience. He thought about Marcus's closing statement, how the young man had exposed the flaws in the system and, in Caldwell personally, with surgical precision. What bothered him most wasn't just the embarrassment of being outsmarted. It was the realization that he had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment. How many other cases had he mishandled because of those same biases? How many lives had he impacted unfairly? A knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," Caldwell muttered, his voice barely audible. It was the court clerk holding a folder in her hands. "Your Honor," she said hesitantly, "there's been a development. Several complaints have been filed regarding your conduct during today's proceedings. They're asking for a formal review." Caldwell felt the blood drain from his face. What kind of complaints, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Allegations of bias and misconduct, the clerk replied softly. She placed the folder on his desk and stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. The Judicial Review Board wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. For a moment, Caldwell couldn't speak. The walls of his chambers seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with the weight of his mistakes. All those years of pride, arrogance, and unchecked prejudice had finally caught up with him, and now he would have to face the consequences. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Marcus was surrounded by reporters eager to hear more about the young man who had taken down a biased judge. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions came rapid fire. But instead of basking in the spotlight, Marcus remained humble and focused. "This victory isn't just mine," he told the crowd, his voice firm yet compassionate. "It belongs to everyone who has ever felt marginalized or dismissed because of their appearance, background, or circumstances. Today proved that intelligence and integrity transcend stereotypes, and that the pursuit of justice should never be hindered by prejudice." His words resonated deeply, earning applause from bystanders and nods of approval from reporters. By the end of the day, Marcus's name was trending online, with headlines praising him as a symbol of resilience and brilliance. Yet despite the acclaim, Marcus stayed grounded, knowing that his work was far from over. That evening, Marcus returned to his small apartment, where stacks of legal textbooks lined the shelves and notes from his Harvard classes covered nearly every surface. Sitting down at his desk, he opened his laptop and began drafting an article titled, "Reforming Justice, Addressing Bias in the Legal System." He wrote passionately about the need for accountability, transparency, and empathy within the courts, drawing inspiration from his experience in Caldwell's courtroom. As he typed, Marcus reflected on the events of the past 2 days. He hadn't set out to humiliate Judge Caldwell. His goal had been to expose the systemic issues that allowed bias to thrive unchecked. Still, seeing the judge squirm under scrutiny had been satisfying, not out of malice, but because it represented a step toward meaningful change. Back in Niam, his chambers, Caldwell poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. The clock ticked loudly, each second reminding him of the impending meeting with the Judicial Review Board. He knew he couldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but perhaps he could begin to make amends. Taking a deep breath, Caldwell picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the person on the other end answered, he spoke, slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I need your help," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I think it's time I learned what real justice looks like." This version of Part 4 delves into the emotional fallout of the trial, exploring the contrasting journeys of Marcus and Judge Caldwell. While Marcus emerges victorious and uses his platform to advocate for reform, Caldwell faces the harsh reality of his actions and begins the difficult process of self-reflection. The narrative maintains a balance between tension and hope, using simple yet evocative language to engage readers. The days following the trial brought sweeping changes, not just for Marcus Johnson, but for Judge Caldwell as well. The story of the young law student who had outwitted a seasoned judge spread like wildfire, dominating headlines across the nation. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for All and Marcus Johnson Effect, turning Marcus into an overnight sensation. Yet despite the attention, he remained steadfast in his mission to create meaningful change. Marcus's journey in. The weeks after the trial, Marcus found himself at the center of a growing movement. Invitations poured in from universities, legal organizations, and community groups, all eager to hear him speak about bias in the justice system. He accepted some of these invitations, delivering powerful speeches that challenged audiences to confront their own prejudices. One evening, standing before a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School, Marcus addressed a crowd of students, professors, and activists. "Justice isn't just about laws or rules," he said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about fairness, empathy, and recognizing the humanity in every individual. If we allow stereotypes and assumptions to guide our decisions, we fail not only those individuals but the very principles upon which our system is built." His words struck a chord, earning standing ovations wherever he went. But Marcus didn't let the praise go to his head. Instead, he channeled his newfound influence into concrete action. He partnered with advocacy groups to launch a campaign called Clear Roads, Clear Justice, aimed at improving road infrastructure in underserved communities. The initiative quickly gained traction, garnering support from local governments and private donors alike. At the same time, Marcus continued his studies at Harvard, excelling in his coursework and impressing his professors with his sharp insights and innovative ideas. By graduation day, he had already secured offers from several top law firms, but he chose to join a public interest organization focused on criminal justice reform. "This is where I can make the biggest difference," he told his mentor during a celebratory dinner. "I want to fight for people who don't have a voice." As Marcus embarked on his career, his name became synonymous with integrity and perseverance. His courtroom triumph against Judge Caldwell served as a reminder that brilliance could emerge from unexpected places, and that no one should ever be underestimated based on appearances alone. Caldwell's redemption. While Marcus thrived, Judge Caldwell faced a much darker path. The Judicial Review Board convened shortly after the trial, launching an investigation into Caldwell's conduct. Testimonies from witnesses, including court staff and even past defendants, painted a troubling picture of a man whose biases had gone unchecked for years. One former defendant tearfully recounted how Caldwell had dismissed her case without giving her a fair hearing, simply because she was young and Latina. Another described being ridiculed for wearing casual clothes to court, much like Marcus had. The evidence against Caldwell was overwhelming, leaving little room for denial. In a closed-door session, he admitted his mistakes, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've spent my entire career believing I was upholding justice," he confessed. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what that really means. I allowed my pride and prejudice to blind me, and for that I am deeply sorry." Though Caldwell avoided formal punishment, thanks largely to his willingness to cooperate and take responsibility, the review board decided unanimously to suspend him from the bench for 6 months. During this period, he would undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and ethics, as well as participate in community service initiatives designed to foster understanding between the judiciary and marginalized groups. Initially, Caldwell struggled to adjust to life outside the courtroom. Without the authority of his robe or gavel, he felt stripped of his identity. But over time, he began to see his suspension as an opportunity, a chance to rebuild himself from the ground up. He started volunteering at a local youth center, teaching civics classes to teenagers from low-income neighborhoods. At first, the kids were skeptical of the stern-faced man in tailored suits, but Caldwell's sincerity won them over. He shared stories from his early days as a lawyer, emphasizing the importance of hard work, integrity, and resilience. Slowly but surely, he earned their trust, and in doing so, rediscovered his passion for justice. One afternoon, while leading a discussion on constitutional rights, Caldwell paused mid-sentence, struck by a sudden realization. "You know," he said, looking around the room, "justice isn't something you hand down from above, it's something you build together, from the ground up. And if we want it to mean anything, we have to listen, to truly listen, to each other." Students nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time in years, Caldwell felt a sense of purpose. Teaching these young minds reminded him of why he had become a judge in the first place: to serve, to protect, and to empower. A new beginning. 6 months later, Caldwell returned to the bench, humbled and transformed. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. Gone was the arrogance and impatience that had defined his earlier years. In their place was a quiet determination to do better, to be better. During his first case back, Caldwell presided over a minor dispute involving 2 neighbors arguing over property lines. Both parties were visibly nervous as they presented their arguments, unsure of what to expect from the infamous judge. But instead of interrupting or dismissing them, Caldwell listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and encouraging open dialogue. When he delivered his verdict, it was fair and balanced, earning nods of approval from everyone present. Word of Caldwell's transformation spread quickly, restoring some measure of respect for him among his peers. Though he knew he could never fully undo the harm he had caused, he vowed to spend the rest of his career making amends. Each ruling he handed down became a testament to his renewed commitment to justice, one rooted in fairness, humility, and accountability. A shared legacy. Years passed, and both Marcus and Caldwell continued to leave indelible marks on the world. Marcus rose through the ranks of his organization, eventually becoming its executive director. Under his leadership, the group achieved landmark victories in cases involving systemic discrimination and unequal access to resources. He also published a best-selling book detailing his experiences titled Beyond Appearances: Fighting for Fairness in an Unjust World. It became required reading in law schools nationwide, inspiring a new generation of lawyers to challenge the status quo. Caldwell, meanwhile, retired from the bench after 2 decades of service. On his final day, he received letters of gratitude from dozens of people whose lives he had touched, many of whom he had wronged in the past, but later sought to help. Among the notes was one from Marcus himself, written in elegant cursive. Dear Judge Caldwell, I once stood in your courtroom as a stranger, judged not by my actions but by my appearance. Today I stand alongside you as someone who believes in second chances, for ourselves and for others. Thank you for showing us that redemption is possible. Sincerely, Marcus Johnson. Tears welled up in Caldwell's eyes as he read the note. For all the pain and regret he had endured, he realized that his journey had led him to a greater truth. That justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about healing wounds and building bridges. And sometimes it took someone like Marcus to remind him of that. Epilogue. Decades later, a plaque hung proudly outside the newly renovated courthouse in New Haven. Inscribed on it were the names of 2 men who had shaped the city's history in profound ways, Marcus Johnson and Judge Thomas Caldwell. Beneath their names was a simple inscription: True justice begins when we see beyond appearances and strive to understand the humanity within. The plaque served as a reminder that even in moments of conflict and misunderstanding, there lies the potential for growth, redemption, and unity. And though their paths had diverged, Marcus and Caldwell's shared legacy endured, a beacon of hope for generations to come. This version of Part 5 concludes the story by exploring the long-term impacts of the trial on both Marcus and Judge Caldwell. Their journeys highlight themes of redemption, self-reflection, and the transformative power of justice, using accessible language and vivid imagery to engage readers until the very end.